The president this week is also facing incoming on national security from Congress and elsewhere. According to the Times, Russia offered bounties to the Taliban to kill American and coalition troops in Afghanistan. The Times reported that the intelligence was part of the president's daily briefing document back in February. The president has lashed out in response, calling the suggestion that he played down or ignored Russian threats a hoax, and he has claimed some officials did not find the information credible. Here is former Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee.
The presidential daily brief is something I read every single day as vice president. The president read it every day. So the idea that somehow he didn't know or isn't being briefed, it is a dereliction of duty if that's the case. And if he was briefed and nothing was done about this, that's a dereliction of duty.
Peter, what is the latest on this story?
Yeah, look, I think that you had two things going on here. One is, of course, you've got the question of how this president deals with information he doesn't want to hear, right? He has made very clear to his intelligence briefers over the years, his advisors over the years, that negative information about Russia isn't really welcome. And this information was put into his daily brief, the written brief, which apparently he doesn't read very often, according to John Bolton and some of his other former aides, in late February, just days before he was about to seal a peace deal with the Taliban. That's unwelcome from his point of view because it might have scotched up that last-minute negotiation. Then the second question is, what about his policy toward Russia? And what you've heard this last week is much more anger about the media than you have anger about whether the Russians might be targeting American soldiers. You hear from the Hill, Republicans like Liz Cheney and others who are known conservatives, longtime staunch skeptics of Russia. They said things like, look, if this is true, this is something we can't stand, that America has to make clear to Russia and anybody else that they cannot threaten our soldiers. Those are words you didn't hear the president say this week. He didn't give any indication that there was any concern whatsoever about whether this is true or not. Now, it's possible that intelligence isn't complete, right? This is no question. Intelligence is often a sketchy thing. It's a balance between different pieces of shards of information. You're trying to make a best judgment. But presidents have acted on incomplete intelligence before because you have to make that judgment. When President Obama launched the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, he was told by his intelligence officials that it was only a 50-50 shot that it was really bin Laden there, and he decided to take the chance. So the idea that the president wouldn't be told simply because it wasn't 100% confirmed or because some intelligence officials disagreed with it raises a lot of questions.
We saw Vice President Biden there, Weijia, talking about the president, and this is a campaign issue as well as a national security issue. The Lincoln Project, an anti-Trump conservative group, Republican group, is going after the president on this matter. Inside the White House, do they see some traditional Republicans peeling away because of this issue or not?
Well, I think Republicans have made really clear that they want answers and that they want to know, too, what the president knew and when he knew it. I think that's one outstanding answer that we do not have, because even though the White House says the president does read and he is the most informed person on planet Earth, what we don't know is why he didn't read this particular information, because we have sources, too, that confirmed it was in his daily brief. And it's sort of, he's damned if he did and damned if he didn't, because if he did read it, why didn't he do something with that information? If he didn't read it, why not? As we heard from Biden, he read the brief every single day. And so I think there's concerns there about how the president is handling this information, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. And it goes again to the heart of what has really troubled President Trump from the beginning, which is his reluctance to be tough on Russia, despite his claim that nobody's ever been tougher. I also think it's important, Bob, to point out, we don't know what he means when he says the Russia bounty story is a hoax, because his own national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, said they were so worried about this information that they did share it with U.S. forces and allies. And so I think he still has a lot of questions to answer. And to your point, two Republicans who want to know.
Jonathan, how are we going to get answers to those questions? We've seen the images this week, the Gang of Eight on Capitol Hill, hearing from Gina Haspel from the CIA. We've seen Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, make some statements. Is the White House thinking about declassifying some of this information to help the public, reporters, get a better sense of what the information is and what was part of that briefing?
So I've heard different conversations in there about declassifying parts of this to try and give a fuller picture. But what I'm not clear on is the way in which I do think they are going to have to reveal more information, more than anything to appease some of these Republicans on the Hill that you were talking about earlier. But I don't know in what form they're going to do that, because if it's done in the sort of cloak and dagger, selective leaks to favored reporters or favored outlets, it's not going to be credible. And it's not going to be believable. And particularly if the selective information is advantageous to the president's side of the story, I think the only way to clear this up is through open testimony, really putting it out there in a public fashion on the record. I think that's the only way that you're going to appease someone like a Liz Cheney.
Peter, what's the context of all of this in terms of geopolitics? You have Putin this week working to extend his power in Russia. You also have President Trump still talking about possibly bringing Russia back into the G7, expanding it into the G8. Is that still on the table?
Well, that's one of the things that makes this so curious, right? It's in between the time that the White House had this information and the time that it was disclosed in the press. The president called and talked to Vladimir Putin 5-6 times. He talked about bringing him to Washington to join the G7 and sort of rejoin, in effect, the community of nations after its incursion into Ukraine when it was thrown out in 2014. And the idea that the president would either A, not be told about this relevant information prior to having these conversations with Vladimir Putin and making this kind of an outreach to him, or B, that he would be told about it and yet still make this kind of outreach, raises a lot of questions about his relationship with Putin. Now, when they say that this administration has been tough on Russia, they can certainly point to a number of things. There's certainly been sanctions that have put on. There's certainly been, weapons were provided to Ukraine and other policy decisions that were made that have been, standing up to Russian aggression, if you will. But what you haven't heard is the President of the United States articulate that. When he says, I'm tough on Russia, he doesn't ever say one thing that's challenging to Vladimir Putin personally. He doesn't, in fact, say anything that would seem to upset the Russian leadership. So for Russia, as you point out, which is in the middle of its own political consolidation of power, Vladimir Putin now authorized by a referendum to stay in power now into the 2030s, they're looking at a situation where they are, they're able to get away with an awful lot of things without the kind of challenge from the leader of the United States that they have been used to in the course of the last number of decades.
Ayesha, just in the final few minutes here, I want to come back to the campaign because it's really on everybody's mind inside the White House on this beat. Is what's next for this Trump campaign as they faced a troubled rally in Tulsa, now this event in Mount Rushmore for President Trump, the slide in the polls. What are you hearing as summer heats up?
Well, it seems like what stands out to me is what I'm not hearing, and that's not really any type of being nimble on their feet and kind of changing and adjusting to what seems to be a shifting landscape in America when it comes to race and when it comes to all these issues. Instead, and to the surging, coronavirus cases. What you're hearing is kind of the same rhetoric that we've been hearing all along. When you listen to some of these campaign calls, they're still talking about, unemployment numbers back from, before the coronavirus that are no longer relevant. And so it doesn't seem like they're really adjusting. And they were really banking on this idea that they were going to have this V-shaped recovery. President Trump is still saying that today, but that hasn't happened. And they're still talking about this idea that, well, they still have time to define Biden. People know of Biden, but they don't know who he is the way the campaign wants them to. My question is, if you haven't defined him now, when are you going to define him? What are you waiting on? And so that's the thing.
Weijia, you want to jump in here as well?
Well, I think also physically it's hard for the campaign right now because they did see what happened after Tulsa, and they saw all the criticism that followed when he went to Phoenix a couple days later. I mean, there were several members of his own advance team who tested positive for COVID, and now you have Herman Cain, who is one of his supporters, testing positive, and there are no campaign rallies on the schedule right now. I think it's really interesting to see when they'll have another one.